everyone, my name is Frida Faisal, and on this channel I explore the culture, history, and stories around Hasidic Jewish communities. Today, for my long-form interview series, I'm going to continue my exploration of the hot topic, Hasidic education. I brought you some videos on the subject exploring what Hasidic education is like and the debate around if the government should step in, like in my segment with Hasidic headmaster Eli Spitzer, the segment with former English teacher in Hasidic school Jerry Albarelli, a video about my own Satmar Hasidic education. I have in the works an interview with ex-Hasidic student Izzy Posen, and finally, today's conversation is with Moshe Krakowski. Moshe Krakowski is a professor of Jewish education at the Azrieli Graduate School for Jewish Education and Administration at Yeshiva University, where he also directs Azrieli's doctoral program. I invited Moshe because he studies American Haredi education and culture, publishing extensively on the subject and visiting many Hasidic schools for his research. I'm delighted to have Moshe today. Thank you so much, Moshe.
My pleasure.
Okay, so let's begin, if we can, by you telling me what you have been doing in Hasidic or Haredi education. What happened that you are doing this research? Was it a particular project, and what did that project look like?
Yeah, so more or less throughout my entire career, I have been interested in Haredi education. So Haredi is a broader category of which Hasidic is one part. In particular because what's unique about Haredi communities is in many respects they are countercultural. They don't quite buy into the framework for understanding the world that other American communities do. So that would separate them from the modern Orthodox, who really do try to blend secular culture, secular knowledge with religious culture and religious knowledge. And what I have always been interested in is how education, and particularly elementary education in boys' Haredi schools, helps to create a particular way of seeing the world, a way of processing the world, a worldview. And an epistemology, an understanding of what knowledge is, how we know things in the world, how we interpret our environment around us. Because I think that it's an unusual thing to be able to grow a community within American society, and yet to really kind of turn the world inside out, right? That the reality is there's a whole big society around us, and we, the Haredi community, I don't mean me, I mean the Haredi community is a little piece inside of it, and to turn that around such that the whole world seems to me to be processed through the lens of a Haredi worldview, and the outside world is just this little bubble or this little thing that I access in different ways, but it's not a part of my reality from the inside. And I believe that a huge portion of this happens in school, but also that school and community, especially in Haredi communities and especially in Hasidic Haredi communities, the school and community are really intertwined in a very deep way, and that you can't understand one without the other. And so a lot of my research is trying to understand what it is about the things that happen in school, from the explicit things that people are taught in school, like the actual, a Rebbe, a teacher telling a boy, this is what the Torah says, to all sorts of very subtle things, like how we organize our time, to who teaches classes, to the little asides that happen in between classes, all sorts of different things that are very subtle in the day that I believe help to shape this way of seeing the world. So that's my overall interest. It's something that's fascinated me for a long time. I have a lot of personal exposure to different sorts of Jewish communities, different sorts of Orthodox Jewish communities, different sorts of non-Orthodox Jewish communities, and the differences between them and how they understand the world have always fascinated me. And so this is something that I've worked on for quite some time.
So to that end, what was the actual work like? What did you do? Did you go to schools, and what kind of schools
Yeah.
did you go to?
Lately, in the last 5 years or so, it's almost been exclusively Hasidic schools in Williamsburg and Borough Park, although one yeshivish school in Lakewood also I visited, but in the past that was more evenly split between the yeshiva world. And for your listeners who don't know the differences, those are the two major branches of Haredi Judaism: the yeshivish or yeshiva world community, which is not Hasidic, and the Hasidic community, which we are talking about. The yeshivish community, you will see men wearing suits and white shirts and black fedoras. And in the Hasidic community, you will see men wearing, well, on formal occasions, the fur hats called streimlach, but also longer coats. And in the yeshivish community, the men don't all have beards necessarily, and if they do, they could be trimmed short, whereas the Hasidic men will have longer beards. There are also important differences in the way the communities are structured. Hasidic communities are structured usually around the Hasidic Rebbe, a religious leader who leads the community. Yeshivish communities are much less centrally organized. People will go to yeshivas. That's part of where the term yeshivish comes from. And there's no one local community that organizes everything, but a person may have a Rosh Yeshiva who they talk to, or who they affiliate with, or a particular yeshiva that they affiliate with. But the same family can have people in 3 different yeshivas, and it's not quite as centrally organized, and it's not as geographically determined, right? So if you belong to Satmar, then you're in Williamsburg, you're in Kiryas Yoel, you might be in Monsey, but there's a very specific geography, whereas in the yeshivish community, it's much less the case. There are lots and lots of other differences as well, differences in religious belief in various ways, but those are some of the bigger ones. But probably the biggest is speaking Yiddish. So Hasidic communities, by and large, speak either exclusively Yiddish or Yiddish as a very strong first language, whereas yeshivish communities speak English. And if they learn any Yiddish, it's just, it's like token Yiddish. It's in order to say that we're learning in Yiddish in school, but can they really speak fluently in Yiddish? Not everyone can. Most people probably can't. They can learn Torah in Yiddish. They can learn Talmud in Yiddish, maybe, but that's not quite the same thing. So for Hasidic communities, Yiddish is very important. And different Hasidic communities obviously put greater or less weight on that. Some are more liberal about the use of English. Some are more strict.
So that brings us around to why there is an important difference in the Hasidic education debate, because it means that if English isn't taught thoroughly in school for yeshivish families, the students will still master the language of the land, whereas in Hasidic communities, oftentimes this means a language barrier, right?
Well, I think that it's true that is a difference. I don't think that that's why. I think that the debate focusing on Hasidic yeshivas is more complicated. It has to do a little bit with who sparked the debate and where they happened to come from, and also the fact that it's not just Yiddish, but that Hasidic communities, with a few exceptions, there are some Hasidic schools that do have a more complete secular education, are more restrictive overall, not just in terms of language, but are more restrictive in what they study in secular education and how much time they devote to it. So it's more than just Yiddish, I would say. It's a whole complex of features, plus the fact that the people who were most upset about secular education came from the Hasidic community originally.
So let's differentiate. First of all, you said that you were interested in elementary school. What grades have you been focusing on, and what does that exclude? And then hopefully you can talk about what you actually saw in the grades you did focus on.
Sure. So it's a little, actually a little bit tricky to talk about grades in the Hasidic community because the grades don't quite work in every school the same way. What I focus on is what we would call K through 8, but the schools mostly use Hebrew lettering for the grades. So Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. Those don't line up with 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of grades. And even when the school year begins and ends can be different from school to school. In some schools, in Satmar and maybe in others, the school year starts after Sukkot, the Jewish holiday that's in the fall, but that can be late October. And that's when the new school year turns over. The cutoffs for what what birthday you have to be in different grades are different in different schools. So it's not exactly a one-to-one mapping. But I would say K through 8 is a rough approximation of what I'm interested in. I have spent time in high schools, so they're called different things in different communities. And in some communities, in some Hasidic communities, the high school is called the Yeshiva Katana, whereas maybe in a yeshivish community, the Yeshiva Katana is the elementary school, and the Mesivta is what the high school is called. So everybody has a different terminology for what they call the different levels as well. But I'll use the roughly corresponding English to say I've spent a little bit of time in some high schools just to know what they're like, but most of my work is with elementary schools, K through 8, really.
In Satmar, which is what I know best, it is cheder. That's how it's called. Any K through 8 is called cheder or chayder is how it's pronounced in Yiddish. And afterwards, it's yeshiva, which is first yeshiva katana, which means the young yeshiva, and then yeshiva gedola, which is high school for older students.
Right. So the Yeshiva Gedola could start anywhere from 16, 17, and the Yeshiva Katana is somewhere, 14 until that point. But again, it depends on the different Hasidic groups. Everybody's got their own system and their own progression of exactly what they want people to be doing when.
Can we call across the board all of what you studied chayder, or was that not the term used everywhere?
Well, not in the yeshivish communities. In the Hasidic communities, yes.
Okay. So, all right. Give us examples of schools you went to and what you saw.
Yeah, so I can't say the specific schools because there's research in them, and there's something called an IRB, Institutional Review Board, that I have to give them anonymity. But I'm sure if you have knowledgeable listeners, they'll probably be able to at least roughly tell, where I'm talking about. But I've been to Hasidic schools from a number of the major Hasidic groups in Williamsburg and Borough Park. Williamsburg is dominated by Satmar, and then lots of other smaller Hasidic groups that are very much in the same religious worldview as Satmar. In Borough Park, you have Bobov and Bells, and then those are, I would imagine, the biggest in Borough Park, and then you have a number of other Hasidic groups that are also not quite as large as those groups. Borough Park has a reputation for being a little bit more liberal than Williamsburg, maybe a lot more liberal than Williamsburg.
What about Crown Heights?
Right. So Crown Heights, right, and Crown Heights has Lubavitch, and the biggest Lubavitch yeshiva there is Olei Torah, which is the flagship institution that was founded by the Lubavitch Rebbe to be exclusive in religious study and not in secular study, which makes it unique. Although there is another big Lubavitch yeshiva in Crown Heights that offers secular education for those who prefer it. Meaning, if you are Lubavitch, you can choose which one you want to be affiliated with.
You're saying yeshiva, but you mean chayder, right? Just to be
Yeah,
clear.
so I'm using yeshiva as a catch-all term for a religious school. So Olei Torah, for example, is not just a cheder; it goes all the way up through what you would call yeshiva Tana, and then yeshiva Gedola as well, right, through the base medrash level. The point is that I'm going to use the term yeshiva to mean educational institution writ large, um, religious educational institution writ large. But yes, so the different neighborhoods matter. Borough Park is a more cosmopolitan neighborhood to begin with, and the Hasidic groups that are in Borough Park are more liberal than the more Satmar affiliated Hasidic groups. So I've spent time in 7 Hasidic schools. 4 I've spent a lot of time in, and I've had conversations with administrators and teachers in at least a half a dozen more schools in these neighborhoods, in those 3 neighborhoods. I haven't really gone to schools in Rockland County where there's a major Hasidic community as well. Just happens to be that once I started focusing on schools in the Brooklyn area, somebody knew somebody in one school who introduced me to somebody in the next school, and that's the network that I stayed in. But I've talked to people in some of those schools as well in the Rockland County and further north areas. Those are the schools. There's one. I guess the first thing to tell your listeners is that there's a tremendous amount of diversity. People imagine, and especially given all of the sound and fury over Hasidic education, people imagine that it's one thing, but it's not. And it's not only different from Hasidic group to Hasidic group, it's different from school to school. Meaning even within the same Hasidic group, there are big differences between the schools. Sometimes these are differences that even people within the community don't really realize. I mean, how would you know unless you were in all the schools? And who is in all the schools? Not very many people. So I'll give you a basic sketch of what the school day is like. And again, this is for boys. This is boys' school, not girls' school. I know you had a wonderful podcast where you opened up some of your materials from when you were in school, which was amazing.
Very different, though.
Yeah, very, very different. I'll give you a basic sketch, and then we can talk about some of the differences between schools. But basically, kids in the younger grades start to come, depends on the school, 8:30, 9:30. They leave in the 4 o'clock, 4:30 range. And that starts to shift at what we would call like 4th grade, 5th grade. They start to come earlier. They start to leave later, maybe not all in the same year, so that they have their morning prayers, the davening in the morning prayers in school, and then have breakfast afterwards. Or they have a small learning seder. That's a time to sit and study religious study before they daven, before they pray, and then they'll pray, and then they'll eat. And for some communities, the kids will, at a certain age, be going to the mikveh in the morning. At a certain point, by the time you hit what we would call 7th, 8th grade, they may be coming as early as 6:30, quarter to 7, and not leaving till close to 6 p.m. So it's a very, very long school day. In the younger grades, they start by introducing the kids, first of all, to reading and writing in Yiddish, right? So the kids speak Yiddish at home, but just like in any school system, just because you speak the language, you have to learn how to read it. You have to learn how to write it. So they start with learning to read and write in Yiddish. They also, at the same time, are learning to read Hebrew, not modern Israeli Hebrew, but biblical Hebrew, which is a cousin, a relative, or maybe it's better to say an ancestor of modern Hebrew, and to start translating biblical text. An interesting difference between the yeshiva communities and the Hasidic communities is that in the yeshiva communities, the goal is that kids start at the beginning of Bereshis, which is the start of the Torah, and by the time they leave elementary school, they go straight through until the end of Devarim, the end of the Torah. Um, in Hasidic schools, they follow a different structure usually. They do each of the weekly Torah portion every week. So we in shuls, in Orthodox communities, the Torah is read every week, and there's a different Torah portion every week, and you cover the entire Torah in the course of a year. So the kids in maybe first grade might only be able to do 3 or 4 verses, psukim, each week, and then they move on to a different topic. When they get to second grade, maybe they do 15 psukim. By third grade, maybe they're doing 30, 40 psukim verses each week of each portion, so that by the time they get to 7th, 8th grade, they're doing the whole Torah portion every week. And that's a very different approach. It's an interesting, I actually am quite interested in just from a cognitive perspective, from a learning perspective, how those differences play out in terms of students' understanding of the Torah. But that's a difference. That's something that starts, kindergarten, first grade, 5-year-old, 6-year-old level. There's at first a lot of call and response in the class. So the Rebbe, the teacher, will read together with everyone, and they'll read it all together, and they'll translate it all together. Then maybe he reads out and they read out. Maybe they read out and then he says the next one, and then they say the next one. There's lots of different models. Then he'll maybe have them turn to each other and each one to his partner, read it, and the other one correct him. Then the other one reads it and he corrects him. There's a lot of public participatory choral reading that transitions over time to independent work. That's the way that it's structured. So if you walk into a Chumash classroom, so Chumash is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses that make up the Torah. If you walk into a classroom of second graders, you may see them, all chanting out loud over their Chumashim with their fingers on the line, ideally. When I was a kid, my Rebbe would always yell at me to keep my finger open Platz, and that was something that I struggled with. But there will be a lot of noise. There will be a lot of, it will be loud. It will be engaged and loud. Actually, the religious studies classes are actually high engagement classes. People, I think sometimes even within the Hasidic community and within the yeshiva world community, don't appreciate how hard it is to keep students engaged at all, and how little engagement there is in ordinary classes across the board, in public school and private schools. And relative to the norm, there's actually incredibly high engagement in Hasidic and yeshiva schools, even in classes that I think somebody who grew up in these communities would say, that's not true, everybody is goofing off or they're not paying attention. They don't have a broad enough perspective to know what really goofing off and not paying attention looks like. It's actually a remarkable feature that there really is high engagement. And that's a result of a lot of different things. It's part of what I study, but predominantly it's the result of a very, very strong social and religious value that is given to what they're doing, right? It's not just school, it's a religious mission. One of the first things that somebody told this to me already, we're 2006, this is 2006 till now, what is that, 17 years ago? Is that right?
2016.
So somebody, a principal of yeshiva said to me, right, this is principal of a cheder, he said that for him, the student could be not really retaining anything, but still the act of learning, right? The word learning means something different in this community. The act of learning has religious meaning, is meaningful, meaning meaning even a weak student who doesn't necessarily comprehend everything is engaging in something religiously meaningful, even just by working through it, even if they retain very little. So that type of attitude that there's a religious value inherent in what we're doing, regardless of how much you end up taking away, actually changes the idea of what it is that the kids are doing. And it's one factor, it's not the only factor, but it's one factor in the creation of high level of engagement. If I could just add one more thing, I think a lot of people, when they think about religious study or Bible, they don't quite understand what it is that the kids are doing. So they have to, when you read a text in a foreign language, right, in Hebrew, you have to translate it. So you have to know the language, you have to translate it. But the way that the Torah has been interpreted and understood over many thousands of years at this point is through a type of very close reading of the text to look for nuances in the language, to identify why it says this word instead of that word. There's an assumption that it's divine and that every word is meaningful, and therefore, why does it add this word here? What is he saying? What isn't he saying? Let's say somebody's speaking in the text. What does the text say here? Why does it say something different there? And kids are asked to think about the text in this way and to read it very closely and carefully. And that's actually an incredibly important skill. This type of close textual comprehension is an incredibly valuable skill. And that's a hallmark of religious study across all topic areas. We'll talk about Talmud in a little bit. That's even more so for Talmud, but even at the Torah level.
Of course, we're all familiar. Even though I've been maybe inside a Hasidic boys' school 2 times in my life. Even though my son was in Satmar at some point and he was in Wien at another point, we all are familiar with the call and response, where it's like the teacher will say the Hebrew of the Bible, like Vaydabai Hashem, and the students answer in the Aivishra Geret El Moshe Tzi, and it's very loud. Even as a tour guide, we'll walk through the neighborhood. There's a Hasidic school that we often pass on Marcy Avenue, and you hear it. It's so loud. And it's interesting to hear you frame it as a high engagement. Obviously, it's also very challenging on the students to spend so much time.
I have this conversation with my students at Yeshiva University who are modern Orthodox students. They're going to be teachers or are already teachers in modern Orthodox schools. And sometimes they say things to me like, well, I can't do this in the classroom. The kids can't handle that. That's too much for the kids. And I say, come with me to a Hasidic school. It's not true that the kids can't handle it. Kids are able to handle much, much more than we give them credit for. And it all depends on the norms. It depends on the assumptions and the norms. If something seems normal to you, if that's the baseline of what everybody does, it only seems too much from outside where you're not used to thinking that way. But from the inside, I think that it is just understood that's what we do. Now, I think that there is some subset of children for whom this is very hard. I think that the Hasidic community has come a long way, especially in the last 10 years, in understanding differences between kids and understanding that there are some kids who you can't just make them sit that way and engage in that way. And there's been a lot of growth in the last 10 years. But even so, if I had to point to what I would imagine is the biggest weakness of the Hasidic system, it's that it's very rigid. And it's very hard if you can't sit and focus. It's very hard. It's very, very hard. And there's been a real growth in this area. I've seen it myself over, even over the years that I've been observing classes. I've seen the growth, but it's still not there yet. To be able, I think that I would say probably 85% of the kids are just fine in this model. For the 15% who it's very difficult, it's important to find ways to engage them and to find alternate ways of reaching them. And schools are beginning already; they're doing a better job now, but still, there's a ways to go. So it is a rigid system, but it's also a high engagement system. When I've on a rare occasion brought my students at Yeshiva University to see more right-wing schools from the yeshiva world, or seen video clips from Hasidic schools when I've been given permission to share those clips, of course, they've been very surprised at what they've seen.
In what way?
That how engaged the kids are, how the kids participate and are taking it. You have to understand that in modern Orthodox schools, this is a blanket statement. It's not a fair statement to make as a blanket statement, but it applies to many modern Orthodox schools. The problem is the reverse, and we'll get to the problem in the Hasidic schools in a minute, but students have a hard time with their religious studies classes. They don't take them so seriously. They feel like it's just an imposition over their real lives. The real stuff is the secular curriculum, and it's hard to motivate the kids in the religious classroom. And when my students see how engaged the kids are in the religious studies in some of the more right-wing schools, they're very taken aback, usually. And so it's the reverse of what you see in the more right-wing schools. My criticism is that, and it's not, again, from a research perspective, I'm not passing judgment. I'm not there to evaluate, are you good or not good? I'm trying to understand the particular phenomenon sociologically, educationally, culturally, from taking a step back as just, Moshe Krakowski Jew. Like, I have the view that the schools could be doing a better job to be flexible for the students who can't handle the very, very rigid structure. That would be my criticism. But as I said, I think they've gotten a lot better at it, but there's still a ways to go, I think.
A lot of this makes me think of a piece of the criticism of the Hasidic boys' education system, which is that high engagement was often extracted, and this I knew when I was a child, and I've heard from various people stories that it was extracted by often means of corporal punishment. Especially the teacher would have a blittige kanchig, which would be the name for his bloody belt, and of course this was larger than life belt that had a whole mystique around it, but it was used, and it was the boys were expected to find their sitzfleisch, find their sitting flesh, because otherwise they stood to the risk was they'd be beaten up. I mean, I don't know to which. Sometimes it would just be hold out a hand and you'd get a couple of slaps, but sometimes it would be a lot more serious. And the issue with us talking about it is, I am sure if you're going to go to their school, they're not going to show you that, right? They're not. Really?
Actually, that's not true because I'll tell you why. It's actually not true because from the administration perspective, it's not something to be embarrassed about. Again, no administrator wants somebody beating up the kids. But to get a patch, right, just an ordinary patch, was very normal. Was very normal for a long time. Yeah, a slap, like a hit on the hand, could be hard. That was very normal, and it was very normal in the rest of the world as well, meaning this was the norm for a very long time in America in public school. It started to be phased out of public schools in the 50s. And as with most things, the more insular your community is, the longer it takes for things from outside to seep in, and that's by design. Nowadays, very, very few schools have any corporal punishment, and those that do, it's much, much less common. There are still few that have it. I was talking to a principal, to the head of the cheder in a certain school, and it's one of the few schools that I know of that still has it. And I was telling him that he has to stop, that it has to be phased out, that it's just, for many reasons. For one reason, I don't think that a patch on the hand is some horrible, terrible thing in and of itself. But if you have that as a policy, you are opening the door for people who have abusive personalities to take advantage of it. And you can't stop them because they'll come and say, no, I just gave him a patch. What are you talking about? So number one, you're opening the door for real abuse to take place. But secondly, we live in a society now where that is not the norm, where that is not a way that we advocate for creating discipline. And it really, you can't just walk. The Hasidic community is very proud of walking in a countercultural way, but on some things you really can't. So I was saying this to him, and he said, I had a Litvish Rosh Yeshiva in my school. So a Litvish is from the yeshiva world. Rosh Yeshiva is the head of a yeshiva institution. He said, and he was saying the same thing as you to me. That's what he told me. And I said, what do you do when a kid is misbehaving? He said, we send him home. So he said, so we tried that. I said, this is the head of the school, the Hasidic school says, we tried that in our school. And the first day, there was the kid who was really misbehaving, and I took him to the office, and I called his mother, and I said, she has to come pick him up. And she said, what are you calling me for? Give him a patch and send him back to class. That was his answer to me. So, okay, that's an answer.
I think that's a very interesting answer because it speaks to something I believe that Hasidic boys' schools are, that sets them apart from other education institutions, is that they are really an arm in the child raising institution, and they take that upon themselves very seriously. They're not like, oh, your child is a problem, you deal with it. Rather, it's their problem to deal with. Furthermore, there's a whole concept of if something goes on at home, the school considers it their mission to step in. But further, in more everyday ways, the whole concept of the mitzvah zettel, where the child comes to school with a note that says, this is what I did at home, that I helped mom, and the school the teacher does a big to do about it, to encourage the student to keep helping mom with cleaning up and so on and so forth. It speaks to the Hasidic boys' schools are very comfortable in taking on a lot of the responsibility of taking care of the children in a way that leaves them, they definitely won't just put the child on the parent when there is a behavior issue. Right.
Now the thing with like mitzvah note, that actually is in almost every Orthodox school. You'll find that that's what I'm saying, is that that's one of the things that I'm interested in is the relationship between the communal culture and the school culture. There is a very different relationship between the school and community in modern Orthodox communities, but it's also intertwined in an important way. It's much tighter in the Hasidic community, that intertwining. But anyway, that aside, I would just say that people who think of corporal punishment in Hasidic schools, who were in those schools maybe 10 or 15 years ago, would be very surprised to see how little of it there is now. And sometimes the principals will speak to me euphemistically, but I know what they're saying. They'll say, oh yeah, that Rebbe, he's a little bit more old-fashioned. We moved him to the lunchroom duty. He's not in the classroom anymore. And I know what they're saying. They're saying he's an old-fashioned Rebbe. He would use corporal punishment, and we can't quite fire him because of political reasons or whatever, or because we don't think it's appropriate to fire him. We don't think he did anything wrong. He's from a previous generation, but we're not tolerating that in our class, and so we're not going to ask him to change either. We're going to move him out of the classroom. And on lunchroom duty, it's a public thing. He's not going to be able to to discipline in that way. And it really has changed, and I'm actually really happy about that, because I just think I think it's not a great way to discipline kids to begin with, but for all the other reasons I mentioned, I really think you really have to stop it.
Sorry, I just want to make a point that I don't think we established at the head, which we probably should have, in terms of terminology. The word Rebbe is what is referred to as a teacher.
Instructor. It's the teacher. It's the male teacher who teaches religious instruction. And for example, in a school, different schools take a different approach to this. Is actually something I look at. In a school that has the Rabbayim, as they'll say it, the Rabbayim, as I'll say it, teach secular studies, which some schools have. When they are in the secular studies classroom, they're no longer Rebbe. They're teacher, this, that, or the other thing. Whereas in the morning, when they're doing their religious studies classes, it's Rebbe. So Rebbe is not just a term for teacher, it's specifically the religious instructor who is teaching religious material.
Okay, so let's return to the school day in Hasidic schools. We were talking about the Torah, we were talking about davening, the prayers, and breakfast. And perhaps before, I'm guessing you're going to move on to the Talmud, but before you do, you can explain what breakfast might look like, or the meals might look like for these students in school?
It depends on the school. In many schools, they'll have meals in school, provided by the school, often subsidized, depending on the demographics of the school. Cereal and milk, hot food, lunches might be, sandwiches, bologna sandwiches, salad, other pretty I think pretty typical food, just in a Hasidic register, meaning with the Hasidic yesterday, as an aside, I attended the Satmar Business Expo. Massive.
Oh, you went.
Massive. Of course I went.
Uh-huh.
It was amazing.
It was amazing.
But if you would go to a trade show somewhere and there would be food out, there would be all sorts of different food. So at this trade show, there's also food out. But what was the food that was out at the Satmar Business? Cholent and kugel and all of, right? So obviously every cultural group is going to, it's very discernibly school lunch, meaning it has the same sort of feel as school lunch in a public school, but register. Uh-huh. That's how I would describe it.
And they eat it in the cafeteria.
Yeah, they have a cafeteria. They eat in the cafeteria. If the school is very large, it might be staggered. Some of the schools have 1,200 kids in a building, and some of the schools I've been to are 200 kids. There's very, very large schools, and there's regular sized schools, small schools. So they'll come to their classes, and the younger grades, they'll also at the beginning of class learn how to daven, how to pray. So they'll learn what the prayers are, and they'll start with certain prayers that they learn. The most important thing is that they recite them properly, but they'll also learn what they mean, and what they're about. Whether or not they retain that down the line is an open question, because often you do the same thing every day and it becomes very ritualized. I mean, it is literally a ritual, and so you may not be thinking about what it means, but they do learn what it means when they're first learning it.
Wow.
And there's a set prayer.
I don't remember ever learning that.
Yeah, so the schools that I've seen, they do. The kids are given taich for what the words mean. The Rebbe talks to them about what each prayer is supposed to be about as they learn it. In some schools, they have a formal curriculum for it where they learn about the prayers and they go through. But it also, there's a lot of instruction. So when you start the Shemona Esrei, which is the main part of prayer, to step 3 steps back, to go 3 steps forward. When do you bend your knees to bow? All of these things, somebody has to teach them. The kids are being taught in school, not just what the prayers are, but how to act during prayer, how to grab your tzitzis at Shema, and all of the different Shema is another major prayer that is said every day. And the kids wear tzitzis, that are the strings that you might see hanging out from the sides of their shirts, and they're held during Shema. So, and there's a particular way of holding them. So they're learning all of these things in the younger grades. As they get older, they're expected to know it at this point. They study Chumash, which is the Torah, the 5 books. Then they might also study some aspects of Jewish law. There may not be a particular curriculum, but they may learn, the laws of Shabbos, of how to act on Shabbos, which are many and very complicated. They may learn the laws of all of the different holidays over the course of the year. Different schools will arrange this differently. It's not the same sort of formal curriculum that is very uniform as we might find with Torah and Talmud, with Chumash and Talmud, but it varies tremendously. One school, more than one school, at some point they go do a year on the laws of the temple, of the Beis HaMikdash, which has not been standing for 2,000 years, but yet we still study the laws, and so they might, spend a year learning all of the laws of the Beis HaMikdash, about how the Kohanim, the priests in the temple, would do the service, what the different parts of the temple are. So the Jewish law can be very hands-on practical and very abstract and theoretical. And then starting in 3rd, 4th grade, they turn to, in addition to their Chumash, they turn to Mishnah. Now, Mishnah is a slightly different Hebrew than biblical Hebrew. It's also Hebrew, but it's a different Hebrew. And it's the backbone of the Talmud. So just for your listeners who don't know what the Talmud is or have heard about it but don't really understand, the Talmud has 2 parts. The Mishnah, which are short, paragraph size statements of Jewish law. Sometimes there's a dispute about the law brought in the Mishnah. They were compiled approximately 200 CE, and they were very likely oral, meaning they weren't written down, but they were orally recited, and they reflected much older traditions. How old and where from and exactly how they came to be in the form that they are is the subject of much discussion amongst academics. On this Mishnah, a very, very rich and detailed and elaborate commentary emerged called the Gemara. And the Mishnah and the Gemara together are the Talmud. And the Gemara is it's like an iceberg where you see the tip and then there's the 90% beneath the surface. The Gemara is like that. It's much, much bigger than the Mishnah. So for every Mishnah, there may be, pages and pages of Gemara. And so kids start with the Mishnayos, because that's the plural of Mishnah, because those are relatively straightforward. There's not a tremendous amount of complex analysis. In some Mishnayos there are, but for the most part, they're very straightforward and simple, and you can cover all of the laws as they are in the Mishnah, so that when you get to Talmud a couple of years later, you are already familiar with the style, with the terminology, with some of the types of concepts that are expressed in the Mishnah. And so that starts, maybe what we would call 3rd grade, 4th grade, something like that as well. The last thing, I'm going to treat the younger grades and the older grades separately. The last thing in the day is secular studies. And secular studies varies also tremendously school by school. Some schools, um, there are a few schools, not many, but there are a few schools that won't even start secular studies. They'll start first grade secular studies in what we would call the third grade age. Some schools will start it in the first grade age, meaning first grade and first grade. Um, some schools will start it in second grade. Every school is different. Um, I would say the majority of schools, I don't know this for sure, but my impression from the schools that I visited and from what I know of some of the other schools is that most schools will do 7 grades of English. Some schools will do, a very few schools will do as little as 5, very, very few. Um, and some schools, probably the same number as do as little as 5, will go all the way through high school with secular education. There are Hasidic schools that really do high school as well, but not many of them. There's only a few such schools. The normative amount is about 7 grades of secular education, and it's focused, um, and it could be from about an hour and 20 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes, 20 minutes to 2 hours and change of the day, of the school day. And in that time, the focus, first and foremost, particularly in the communities where everybody really speaks, like in Borough Park, I think that most of the kids have familiarity with English and even speak English. In Williamsburg, very few of the boys speak English at all. So the same English curriculum, right, the same amount of time spent on secular studies, the same English curriculum, the same books in two schools from the same Hasidic group in Borough Park and in Williamsburg are going to have a very different impact, because in Williamsburg you have to learn English. You have to actually learn the language. And in some of the schools that I've seen, what they focus on in the earliest grade is not just, but predominantly oral recitation, meaning speaking. They have scripted conversations. Good morning, teacher. Good morning, students. What day is today? What is the date? Meaning to practice speaking together with reading and writing. In all Hasidic schools, English language arts writ large is number 1, and math is number 2. Those are the top. And other than a school that specifically does not study secular education at all, which I know of only one such school, every school learns uh, uh, English language arts and math at least through a 5th to 6th grade level. That's the minimum, meaning many do more, but fractions, decimals, addition, subtraction, multiplication, percentages, these are all things that they do in math. In English language arts, the expectation is that kids should be able to read a sentence, to write a sentence. In some of the schools, they're writing paragraphs and essays. But for the Hasidic community, the goal of secular education is very pragmatic, meaning the religious belief of this community is that this material, that the secular world is fundamentally treif, meaning not kosher. And that, yes, there are certain skills that you will need. The contrary to popular belief, people think, oh, they don't work. The Hasidic community works. Everybody is expected to work. When I've looked at the occupation lists of parents in schools, you don't see almost anybody not working. Almost every parent, every male parent is working, is employed. They're expected to go to work at a fairly young age. I mean, I was just at the Satmar Business Expo. It was amazing, like to see the businesses that people are involved in and to see the entrepreneurship, to see just the degree of sophistication is actually incredible. Um, and and there are many thousands of people there. It's not a small, it's not a small thing. The goal of the secular education is we want to provide our kids with enough skill such that when they then want to go pursue an education, an occupation, whatever it is that they want to do, they have the backbone and they will bone up on whatever they need. So, for example, if you were at, just because I went yesterday, if you were at the Satmar Business Expo, you would see architects like that. There are lots of architects. There are tons and tons of people know this of Amazon sellers. But then there's a whole cottage industry of people who create software for the Amazon sellers, inventory trackers, customer service things, delivery vehicle, GPS management systems. Where did these people learn how to code? Where did they learn to program? How did they manage this? Well, the idea is that when you are ready to go get an occupation, you have enough of a foundation to be able to turn that into something that you want. Obviously, that pushes people in the direction of business. It does not push them in the direction of, let's say, medical degrees, because you need a tremendous amount of education for that, and they are religiously opposed, for the most part, to doing that. There are exceptions. If somebody wants to, and they're not rocking the boat religiously in other ways, they can go do, something that requires much more education. And I know more than a few people who are still very much within communities like Satmar even, and Babas and Bells and other communities who are in professions that require a tremendous amount of education. But that's not the goal. That's not the norm. Meaning you can do it if you want to do it, and you're not interested in rocking the boat and trying to undermine the system. But it's not where we prefer. What you see is a lot of entrepreneurship. What you see is a lot of work in businesses. And the reason that we're talking about what the occupations are is because you can't understand the education that's happening in the school in third grade without understanding where this community sees the role of secular education. Because fundamentally secular culture and secular knowledge are treif, are things that are religiously problematic. They very, very carefully monitor what it is that we're going to teach for the specific goal of being able to function in the world. Also, not just in jobs, but in being politically aware, for example, knowing how to access the institutions, the banks, the government offices, any of the other things in society. To be able to function as a member of American society, you need a certain baseline. That baseline is not very high. People who do education research know this, but every year or every few years, there's a national assessment that gets sent out to grown-ups, giving them an assessment on what they retain from their elementary and high school education. And most people who are grown-ups score at a sixth grade level, meaning history knowledge, science knowledge, math, reading and writing. Most people are at a sixth grade level. And the reason is because that's the baseline that you pretty much need to function. And after that, you won't hear me saying that knowledge is not valuable, because it is. It's absolutely valuable. But it's not necessarily pragmatically valuable, meaning it's not necessarily needed depending on what you choose to do. And you can use that knowledge to go further. So you heard me talking about math and English. Some schools have a robust social studies curriculum, really covering everything that you would do in a public school, go through the explorers in fifth grade, and, just the same as everybody else would do, but from kosher textbooks. Nowadays, the difference between many years ago is that many years ago, they would take old public school textbooks and censor them. And now you have a whole bunch of kosher publishers who adapt public school textbooks for the sensibilities of a Hasidic community. And so you can use a textbook that has stories and has history and has all of the different things, but without any material that might be considered problematic. And the last is science. Some schools have a certain amount of science, but even in the schools that are strongest in secular education, science is very limited to particular topics. Um, and I'll take a step back and I'll say from my uh, um, uh, from a professor standpoint, from an academic standpoint, why? And that's because science really is the competing epistemological framework for society. You have a religious epistemology and you have science. And what I mean by that is it's a framework. It's not just a content area. It's a framework for processing and understanding the world. It's a way of making sense of the world that is in competition with the religious way of making sense of the world. And so it's particularly dangerous, and it's particularly fraught. And so schools are very, very careful because it violates their religious beliefs, because in many respects, things that you learn in science violate their religious beliefs, and so they are very, very careful about what they allow in science. Even in the schools that do give a decent amount of science, it's very carefully monitored.
I do want to explore further what you're saying about how the boys are taught English in order to have the rudimentary knowledge to make it in the world. And I have explored the Hasidic economy. I know so many Hasidic business people, and all through the years I have watched so many people from the community, ex-Hasidim, and the media tell stories of this population of crippled people who have had their legs cut out from under them because they weren't taught English. And I always looked around and I always thought to myself, well, that's not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing extremely high energy and sophisticated business people who manage to negotiate the world very effectively with a broken English, perhaps, but very effectively. And I always thought the connection between Hasidic secular education and poverty rates, which are high, is misleading, is unfair, often doesn't represent reality, and certainly doesn't represent that most people earn a living. Like you said, it doesn't surprise me at all that the parent roster, the majority men are employed. But
Not just majority, almost the entirety, meaning almost no unemployment.
almost no unemployment. I have run across. It is incredibly rare for me to hear of someone who's actually, for instance, in Williamsburg, sitting and learning and is not employed. Although the media will tell this incorrect story that the boys are taught to study and that's what they do for life, and then that's what they do instead of going on to earn a living. That's not correct. But obviously there are some who go on to study Torah, but that's outside of the preparation of their education. It's because that's what they believe they should be doing for life. But I want to talk about the purpose of secular education, because I grew up in Satmar and we always knew that the boys learn this little smidgen of English, or to the degree to which it is or isn't a smidgen, but it was there in order to satisfy the government. We had no sense of it being for any practical use. In fact, something I have argued, and feel free to explain that you disagree, is that the Hasidic education system for boys and girls, I would say, is not designed with a career and practical value in mind. It's there to take the children off mom's hand, and of course to study the Torah more than anything. And the secular education is there because that's what the government has mandated.
Yeah, I don't think that's correct. I think that people may say that, meaning there are lots of things that people say, but when you look at something and you try to understand how it works, what people say is only one thing, and not everybody says that either. If that was really the case, then in the different Hasidic schools, you wouldn't see such a wide variety, both in what is taught and in how much effort goes into it. many schools, even some schools that you would, from the outside, I think people in the Hasidic community would think, oh, they must not have very good secular education. You don't know. If you walk into those offices where you have the people who are working on it, who are trying to teach, who are trying to build the curriculum, who are organizing the instruction, they are very committed. And they're not committed, because the government tells us. In fact, often the government is an impediment to their goals because their goals and the government's goals are not the same. They want to make sure that the kids are getting particular content for particular purposes, in particular ways, that are specific to the Hasidic community. And that is not something that necessarily lines up with what the government's interest is. And so I don't think that's right. I think that there may be people who say that, but if you actually look at what's happening in the schools, you see that they really do want to, and when you talk to the people who are actually running it, meaning rather than just people in the street, when you talk to the people who are organizing the instruction, they're thinking in a very deliberate way. We have an hour and a half right now, every day, from Monday through Thursday. What are we going to do in this hour and a half? And they're very targeted, and they're very specific about how we're going to make use of this time for maximum effect. And it is also the case that there's a lot of give and take between the parents and the Hanhala, that's the administration of the school, and the Rebbe or his people. It's a community. And so, for example, you could have a Hanhala, an administration that wants to introduce something more, and a parent body that says no. That happened in one school that I know of, where they introduced a new textbook that had some science topics in it. This is in one of the more extreme schools that didn't, and parents broke in and stole the textbooks in the middle of the night, and they rebelled, and they said no. In another school, they tried to do, one year, they did a STEM unit, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. They did a STEM unit for 1 week. The kids loved it. The kids absolutely loved it. And there's no religious problems really in the content in technology, engineering. And there was such an outcry that they weren't allowed to do it again. And that was from the parents. In another school, the parents wanted more secular education, a different Hasidic group. They wanted the school to introduce secular education in 8th grade, which they had only gone through 7th grade previously. And the push came for a few years, and a couple of years ago, the school switched and went to 8th grade. And this is in a very major Hasidic group. So there's a give and take, meaning I think that's actually one of the misconceptions about the Hasidic community, is that it's all top down. The rabbinic leaders tell everybody what to do. No, it's like every community. There are all sorts of different competing pressures. People are not sheep. People are not like just following what they're told. There's kanoim, extremists who are pushing one way. There's other people who are saying, no, we don't want that. There's the Rebbe and his religious views, his political views, especially if you're in a Hasidic group where there's a split between two competing Rebbes, then everybody has to think about what the other one is doing versus, meaning there's all sorts of sociological pressures that come from the ground up as much as they come from top down. And those are impacting what's happening. But there's a lot of thought that goes into it, meaning these are the administrators in these schools. They're grappling with religious belief. They're grappling with, what do we think our kids need? What do we want to focus on in the time that we have? And some of them do a very good job, given the constraints. And some of them don't. Some of them think they're doing a good job, and they'll say to me, look at what we're doing. And I don't want to say anything, but it's not actually so good. So there's a lot of variety, but I would say that overwhelmingly the way that I described it really is the underlying objective is that you want to create a baseline level where if somebody then wants to do something when they have to go to work, and if somebody is going to live in America, that they're going to be able to function, that they're going to be able to interface with the world outside of their own community in a way that is responsible, in a way that is functional, not to be a part of the outside world. That's not what we want, but to be able to interact with it and to interface with it, to live within American society in a way that that is maybe symbiotic. That there's it's separate, but there's a relationship.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I really was talking in particular about the English curriculum being a kind of Hasidic career prep. I'm not talking about writ large going through the secular world. One of the biggest criticisms I saw of Hasidic education is Hasidic boys, young men who go to the doctor and can't express what their ailments are, what their symptoms are to the medical staff because their English is so poor. And I think anyone in the Hasidic community, many in the Hasidic community, including, I would imagine, many in the Hanhola, in the administration of the secular education, would find that something worth targeting. Like they'd be concerned about that as well. That the boys should be able to go to the doctor and communicate with the doctor what the problem is, get around in the world.
I can't say that's never happening, but that's very surprising to me. That does not ring true from any of the people who I've spoken to, now granted I understand Yiddish, but first of all, in Hasidic communities, there's a very, very sophisticated use of healthcare. You go always to the top person, and there are people who know who those people are, and there are resources, there are organizations. I, many years ago, had a situation where we really, really needed consultation from top doctors, and we ended up talking to people in the Hasidic community to really understand who were the doctors that knew the most, what were the hospitals that were really good at doing these sorts of things, which ones were supposedly good but actually didn't have good outcomes. Meaning there's a lot of communal knowledge, but there's also, that's precisely what the secular education is preparing people for exactly that level of interface, of communication. I'm sure there are people who had difficulty, but meaning because there's always something, but as a common phenomenon, it just doesn't ring true with my with what I've seen. Yeah.
I just visited a diamond cutter for a segment on his trade and a little bit about the diamond industry, which of course is in extreme decline. And the gentleman who showed us around kept lapsing into Yiddish. His English was, he really was so much more sophisticated in Yiddish. And towards the end, I asked him, how did you find your secular education impacted your career trajectory? And he says, I got 2 hours of English a day. I learned English. We didn't have a problem. I said, but did you find, because his English was really, he was not very comfortable. Since I speak Yiddish, he kept lapsing into Yiddish. So I said, but how did you find that your English was, your difficulty with English impacted you? And he said, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? I speak English. we had a little bit maybe different perceptions. It was interesting that for whatever language in proficiencies he had confidence that he didn't experience it as an issue.
Right, and he's in an industry where you can get away with speaking a lot of Yiddish, meaning a lot of the people who he's likely doing business with are other people who speak Yiddish, and he probably doesn't have as much of a need to speak English. And that's the way it is when you learn any language, meaning You come out of your school with a sixth, seventh grade, maybe even eighth grade education in English, but you never speak it outside of school. Outside of those 2 hours, you
Yeah.
never speak it, and you don't ever speak it again, it's going to atrophy, right? And so that's, it's not for lack of teaching it. It's that if you're going to live in a community where you never speak it, it will not take root in a real way. You have to speak a language. You can't just learn it academically in order to be successful. And so that's actually something when people talk about the Hasidic education system that I try to point out that you're not really complaining about the education. When somebody says, I don't, he doesn't even speak English. Well, you learned English. You're complaining about the religious belief in the Hasidic community, not a religious belief I share personally, that one has to speak Yiddish, that one has to speak Yiddish at all times, and that speaking English is only an absolute necessity if you must. And that belief has all sorts of sociological impacts. It helps keep the community cohesive, um, helps separate the community from other communities such that they can continue to grow in the explosive growth that they've had. But that's a religious belief that takes root completely independently of education. A community that teaches the exact same amount of English and then goes and speaks English on a regular basis outside of their community. For example, like in Lubavitch, Chabad Lubavitch, they speak Yiddish and English, and they speak English all the time. They don't have any more instruction. But if you're going to use the language outside of class, then you're going to retain the language. And if you never use it again, or if you only ever use it once every 2 months for some particular purpose, then you're going to have very weak language skills. It's not an education issue, it's a cultural issue, and it's a cultural choice. And you could agree with that choice, you could disagree with that choice, but it's a red herring to look at the actual education. That's not the issue.
I think my view personally is that people put too much value perhaps on um, formal learning and not enough on cumulative learning through osmosis through going through life. I think the majority of what we actually absorb and what we learn is from life, and whatever we sit in our desks in a classroom with a teacher at the helm, those are periods of socialization, of learning values.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual instruction that you learn how to do long division, those things we really only absorb it in the application in life. And I find it really interesting when it comes to the Hasidic education debate is that people seem to think that there is such a direct line between what you're learning in the classroom, sitting in that behind that desk, and what's going to happen when you enter the entire world, especially the economic world. And there is often this narrative of, oh, girls, they learn English and they go on to be the breadwinners and support their learning husbands, and that's why they learn English. There's like a straight line, and this is complicated by the fact that it's true that girls learn a lot more English, and they not only learn a lot more English, but in application they speak a lot more English and are more comfortable in English.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I mean, the research backs this up. This is not a chiddush. This is not a novel insight. We know this. Most of education is socialization and signaling. Socialization to socialize you into a set of communal norms and assumptions, and signaling to let other people know based on how you did what type of person you are. Are you the sort of person who will work hard at things? Are you the sort of person who will fit in and not rock the boat? That's most of what we have in education is not actually applied to our daily lives, is not actually used. It doesn't have a huge impact on whether we are successful or not successful in doing things, only in as much as it creates a society in which we have a particular role and we can be placed by other people in particular ways and seen by other people in particular ways. That's what it does. Now, I happen to think that education is valuable independently of this, meaning there are deep philosophical reasons why education, I think, is important. Just to know things about the world, to understand the world, it changes you as a human being. But these are very existential like reasons. They're not pragmatic reasons. They're not uh, you know they're not. It's not like there's a direct correlation between what you learn in elementary and high school and then college and what you're able to do, unless you're learning something that is very particular to to what you intend to do. This is not a novel insight. This is, I think, pretty clear in the data, and that's, so then if you're in a community that isn't part of that same social world, that very specifically wants to be separate from that social world, then education takes on a very different meaning, and then you only access it for those particular things that are valuable to you.
Yeah. Well, I guess we've covered, I feel like we did pretty good. We've covered most of what I was hoping we will talk about. Thank you so much for your insight. Before I let you go, first of all, I want to fact check myself. What do you know about homework for Hasidic boys
In general or in secular
in
studies?
general?
Some, uh, that's an interesting question, because now I'm thinking about a couple of the schools that I visited, and I'm not even sure I know whether those schools have homework. Some schools for sure give the kids homework. Sometimes the homework is kriya, so to read something to a parent signs off, or to read and translate something to a parent. There's a lot of contests, who can do this many prakim chapters of something
Yeah.
at home over a particular period. Um, so I definitely know of some of the schools that I visit where for sure there is daily homework, and even in secular studies, there's short daily homework in some of the schools. But that's a really good question, because I'm realizing now that I have to go back and look at my notes, my field notes from some of these schools, that I don't remember off the top of my head what the homework plan is, or whether there is in some of these schools. For sure in some of them.
Yeah, for sure. So I do know about Korea. In my own experience, my brothers had hardly any homework. There were, like you said, programs of do this on your own time, do X or Y, but the involvement of the splitting the curriculum in large part with what you do at home, which is how it's done to a pretty significant degree in public schools, where you go home with a lot of work. That and in girls' schools, in Hasidic girls' schools, that didn't exist for the boys. So I'm curious.
Part of it might be because of the late day, right? You're basically going to school through the time that you would be doing homework, right? So if your day ends at 5:45, like, that's way different than if you're coming home at 3. Like, it's 3 more hours. So really, you're doing a lot of that in school. One thing that I think, if you can indulge just a couple of minutes, that I think is very important to just talk about, is Talmud study. We really never got to the older grades in Talmud study, and I just want to explain to your audience what that is, because people have heard the term and they don't really know what it is. But we talked earlier just about the Gemara that comments on the Mishnah. And what kids are learning to do, for one thing, it's in Aramaic. The Babylonian Talmud is not in Hebrew. It's a related language, Aramaic. It's another language to learn. And it's incredibly complicated, sophisticated, and in-depth argumentation and reasoning, where you have to read very, very carefully and think in this very, very particular way, where you move between very deep, abstract logical principles and local contextual examples where there's a lot of rich context. And so kids will be learning how to read and translate and to make arguments about for example, and just I'm now working on writing up an analysis of a particular class that I observed 12 and 13-year-olds, where they were analyzing the rights and responsibilities of people who watch items for other people. And then the item gets lost or stolen, and the watcher comes and says, I don't want to take an oath that I wasn't at fault, so I'm just going to pay you for it. Now we find the thief. Who gets the double payment from the thief? Because thieves pay double what they stole. And how those sorts of questions relate to concepts in completely different domains, like to talk about who gets that payment, and then to bring a proof from a Gemara that deals with, how a husband and wife are betrothed to one another by, the giving of an object of value and saying, you are betrothed to me. Why would those two domains have anything to do? But then, right there, so looking at the context in one case, context in another case, very different, but then drawing some abstract principle that's at play, a legal principle, a logical principle, a principle about how to make inferences from text. There's something very, very important and sophisticated that happens in kids' Talmud study that is incredibly valuable educationally, and that we see in the literature. There's a small amount of literature about how kids who are in Haredi contexts take what their Talmud study and apply it outside of Talmud. And you see very clearly that there are certain types of reasoning skills, in particular, the ability to move between local context and abstract principles, and the close textual reading, that are incredibly, incredibly sophisticated, that you don't see even college kids in top universities able to do because they've never been trained in it. And I feel like it's very important for your readers to know that this is what, from 9:30 to 4 o'clock, what the kids in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade are doing. And then after that, what they're doing all the time is going through these texts in Aramaic and in Hebrew, translating them, reading them, analyzing the arguments, trying to build arguments to understand what somebody's question was, what somebody's answer was. And that it's not just, I think people sometimes think about religious education that it's, you're just learning your faith, right? You're getting instruction in your faith. But there's actually very little instruction in one's faith in the Talmud. I mean, it's there in places, but much of it is like this very, very hyper-specific discipline of logical reasoning and textual comprehension. And so, even when we talk about secular education, it's not like, you may have a limited amount of secular education in one area, but you're actually doing something quite remarkable in the rest of the class. And honestly, I think that if I would explain to somebody, like if I would walk through what was happening in a 7th grade class to somebody who never had exposure to it, like I would sit there and explain, it would probably take me about 5 or 6 hours just to give enough background for somebody to really actually understand what's going on. And that relates to how complex and how deep it is that the subject matter that they're learning. And I don't take it for granted. And I test the kids. Whenever I go into classrooms after class, I am always, sometimes the Rebbe, the instructor, will allow me to ask questions during class because he wants to show off his kids. But I will grill them on what they've learned. I will ask them questions that I'm not a great Talmud scholar, but I study Talmud every day, all the time. And I know quite a bit at this point in my life. And I ask them, questions that come from commentaries. I ask them to analyze what they've learned, and they really can do it. They're very, very good at this. I can't help, it's such a remarkable feature of Haredi and Hasidic education that it would be a shame that it wasn't even mentioned in the conversation. I feel like I have to bring that in because it actually really is remarkable.
I mean, I haven't studied it, so I can't speak for myself. You know, I don't. I've heard very often about the tremendous concentration, the tremendous amount of cognitive mastery that goes into the Talmud, and I can only hear about it. We did talk.
Right.
We did talk.
You could pick up a
I know.
Gemara
I
and
have
learn it.
tried a
There's
little.
nothing stopping.
I have tried a little bit. I have tried. I always thought that that's what I would do. That it was once the plan. Perhaps one day. But anyway, I feel like this was really interesting and really gave us not only such a full story of the boys' education, but also I feel like we talked about some of the criticisms and some of the analysis of what education does, and in terms of economics, which is often what we think about most, and I feel really enriched by this talk. So thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I always like to talk about this subject.
It's a good subject. I was thinking we'll go on for a while if I'm not gonna be on top of it.
Yes, but I will just tell you that I learn a tremendous amount from your videos and podcasts, from all of the people who you bring on, and it's actually
thank you.
You do a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for joining among my guests.